to talk about big data and what we can do with big data for the purposes of reducing poverty. And I would argue that we have too many dystopian visions right now. It's very popular to be a bit on the apocalyptic side. And I want to offer up one utopian vision. It's arguably a limited utopian vision. It doesn't take us entirely to where we want to go, but it takes us maybe partway. And it's related to a very old utopian vision. It's what Daniel Bell once referred to as the end of ideology. And the idea is that we want to put politics back in its place to settle kind of deep normative questions, but not bread and butter policy questions about how to get the job done. So politics is all about what we want to get done, and evidence can be used to tell us how to get it done. So that's the overview of the talk. You can leave now if you want, because that's the big idea. And it may seem implausible that we can get there, especially in current times. But I think there is a way for it, and I'm going to try to lay that out. So let me start with this particular vision. It could be called the technocrat's dream, and I want to lay out what it's all about. So we start with policy, and that's supposed to be under this utopian vision. It's supposed to be something that's formed through the democratic process. It's a reflection of the public will as to what sorts of policies we would want. And then you have to translate that commitment for a particular type of policy into particular programs. It has to be concretized. It has to be rendered into an actual plan of action that will allow those policy commitments to be realized, right? And then, despite our best laid plans, things often go awry, right? It doesn't play out exactly as intended. There are unintended consequences. So you got to evaluate your particular programs against the evidence to see if they're achieving the objective aims. And then on the basis of that evidence, you might then revisit your policy commitments. What you thought might be feasible would prove in the end not to be feasible. And so you would go back with the evidence and perhaps rethink what the appropriate policies are in light of that evidence. That is, I would argue, an idealized version of what a technocrat might want out of social policy. Now, of course, this dream hasn't been realized. Daniel Bell referred to the end of ideology, but no one in their right mind would ever think that what we now have is anything like this, right? It couldn't be further from the truth. So the end of ideology that Daniel Bell discussed has not come to pass, and you might ask then, why? So here's one conventional account as to why this hasn't happened. You might refer to it as bureaucratic resistance. So the idea is those folks on the ground who are charged with implementing the policy that's supposed to come out of the democratic process, those folks on the ground, they resist it. They have all their own agenda and aspirations and goals, and they're not necessarily consistent with the policy instructions they're given. And that bureaucratic resistance on the ground means that the policy commitments that were a reflection of the public will are subverted when they're actually instantiated on the ground. That's one story. Here's another one, conventional account. This is sort of the academic's favorite account. We're doing this wonderful research that has extraordinary policy relevance. We know exactly how it should come down because we're doing the research that indicates that, and for some reason those stupid politicians just don't listen to us, right? And so it's not like there isn't more than adequate evidence. We know what's to be done. They're ignoring us. They're not taking into account the wonderful evidence that we're providing. That's another story. So it's the politicians are under no compunction to listen to evidence. I think think there's some merit to each of those stories, but I want to offer up a third one, which I think has gone underappreciated and is pretty important in understanding why we haven't realized this technocratic dream, as I've called it, and that's an evidence deficit. And the argument is we simply have not amassed the quality of evidence that we need to understand whether or not some programs are working and others aren't. And that so it's really a failure on the part of science, if you will, to deliver the goods when it comes to incontrovertible evidence on what's working and what isn't. And this then has some side effects that are problematic. First off, one reason why the evidence, if you will, is ignored is that it's not very good. It's a booming, buzzing confusion of evidence, or it's just simply inadequate evidence. And so it's ignored because it's quite eminently ignorable. And then secondly, this translation process from policy into programs is really difficult to do because we don't know what programs will successfully realize our policy commitments. So it's not just bureaucratic resistance, it's not, we don't know how to do it. Again, that's a failure of evidence, right? It's a failure of evidence that tells us what sorts of programs would best realize our policy commitments. So it all comes down, so I would like to argue, to a failure on the part of science to deliver the evidence we need. There are other reasons why we haven't achieved that agenda, but that would be an important precursory achievement that would be needed insofar as we're to try to get there. We need to, at minimum, provide the sort of evidence that is necessary to allow us to make the policy choices and the program choices that we need to make. So I want to talk about how this plays out with respect to California and efforts to reduce poverty in California, and how this failure, if you will, on the part of science is hampering efforts to reduce poverty in California, and also, and more importantly, how we can overcome this problem. So a bit of background about California. We think of it as the land of, I think of it, most people think of it as the land of plenty. An immensely successful economy, a huge economy. Californians love to boast about how, if they were a country, the economy would be one of the top ones in the world. I can't tell you how often I hear that. It's a bit tedious, but here I am saying it. But there's another side to California that's perhaps less appreciated, and that's that it's the land of poverty as well as the land of plenty. By one very important and arguably best measure of poverty, the supplemental poverty measure, California comes out as the highest poverty state in the country. That result is shown here. Probably can't see it all that well, but this is California down here at the bottom, and it has a supplemental poverty measure. It's over 20. This was a few years ago. It's now reduced a bit, but it's still the highest in the country. So then you might say, how can we take this on? And it's not just an academic question. The bill was recently passed and signed by Governor Brown, the governor of California, AB 1520, that prepares the way for a mandated reduction in poverty. The original version of this bill, I have to say, mandated a 20% reduction in poverty, a 50% reduction of poverty in 20 years. It was very, very carefully selected long time period, 20 years, so that we could implement the sorts of very basic structural reforms that would make it possible to reduce poverty. So not just a quick and easy fix, but major institutional changes that would be necessary so that we could have an enduring and permanent reduction in poverty. And AB 1520, as it was originally conceived, was supposed to, in effect, tie our hands as a state to that commitment. It's now reduced to a task force that will study whether or not, so it was passed as a task force that will study whether or not indeed we can successfully realize that mandated reduction. I think at the end of the day, this recommendation will come to pass. It will set in motion a chain of events that will lead in the end to this mandated reduction in poverty. So I think likely we're going to have a very, very big job ahead of us in California to actually achieve that 50% reduction within 20 years. So we will have some big decisions ahead of us as to how we might bring that about. And there are several options on the table. One is, and we talked about this a bit yesterday, one is to redistribute income. You could take, say, a basic income approach. That's one redistributive approach among many. And you could also, though, redistribute in other ways. You could use, instead of an unconditional redistribution of income, that is, just give them money no matter what. You could tie some conditions to it, right? Work conditions or otherwise. You gotta worry, of course, about the usual things we worry about with any redistributive effort. We might think about disincentives, labor supply effects, and so forth. There's a lot of issues that have to be resolved. If you go down that road, evidence would have to be accumulated on a variety of possible approaches. Or you could universalize services. So instead of making it possible for people to pay for services by giving them more money if they're poor, instead you could say, well, we'll just give you the services free, right? So you could, free child care. In the U.S. case, that's very important because it's often not free. You could undertake all sorts of other decommodifying interventions that provide basic services that are important for children and adults. I listed just some of them. And so you would have to, of course, decide which one of these to deliver, which ones have the highest payoff. And you'd, of course, have to consider how these various investments might interact among one another. So there's a lot, all this is to say that there's a lot of decisions that have to be made about how you're going to get this done, right? And you'd like to, ideally, one way to make them is on the basis of priors and pre-commitments and in ideology and politics. The other possibility is to make these decisions on the basis of the evidence. That is, which of these various commitments will realize the highest return for the lowest amount of money. So I just want to stress then that it's pretty daunting in terms of the evidentiary requirements that are ahead of us if we want to make these decisions on the basis of actual data. We have to decide how to intervene. Should it be conditional cash transfers? Should it be unconditional cash transfers? Should it be direct delivery of services? So the how question, then there's the when question. Do you want to intervene principally prenatally, in the early childhood, at the formal schooling period? Do you want to engage in workforce development policy, that is after people are trained, and help them enter the labor market? Or do you want to engage in even later interventions once people are already in the labor market? There's a lot of when questions here, right, that have to be resolved, or some combination, and then how do you decide what combination of interventions at various points in the labor force? In the life course. And then there's the where question. We have a whole set of institutions that are poverty generating institutions. They do other things too, but they certainly generate poverty. Family, criminal justice systems, neighborhood, schools, the labor market, tax policy. And so you got to decide in what institutions you want to intervene. Big decisions. And so all I want to emphasize at this point is if you want to have true evidence-based policy, ideally, you want a return on investment for each possibility. You want to know how they interact and thereby choose the optimizing constellation of programs. Okay? So it's daunting. You can understand now why we aren't where, say, Daniel Bell wanted us to be. It's really hard. A lot of data and evidence would need to be accumulated in order to make a true evidence-based set of decisions. Okay. So we don't have the capacity at this point to answer these kinds of questions about where the return on investment would be highest. But here's what I want to say. We should turn to the task of developing that capacity to answer these questions with all due speed. It should be, I would argue, one of our highest priorities. And if we don't do it soon, cynicism will set in. And the idea of running our our reforms on decisions on the basis of the evidence will give up on that. We'll say it's just impossible. We'll get cynical about it, and this sort of vision will be dropped. And I think at a huge cost, because if you cannot make these decisions on the basis of the evidence, exactly how are you going to make these decisions? What's the alternative that someone would put forward as something we would want? Well, it would be what we have now, right? The decisions are made on the basis of political priors, not in the evidence, not on where the return on investment is highest, an ideology, a religion. That's the alternative. So are we four square in favor of that? I don't see any argument for that. So I think it's non-trivial to solve this problem. It's arguably one of the most important decisions that we'll make. Are we going to go all in on this vision? And if we aren't, what exactly are you for? So that's my little advertisement for why we should do it. So let me now turn to how we're going to do this. If you agree with me that we should want to do this, how are we going to get there? Okay, so my answer to that is we need a massive longitudinal panel. It actually already exists in the U.S. and California case, and we just have to build what's already there in latent form. It's kind of extraordinary that we haven't done this. And so I want to say how we can do it. 3 steps. So step 1, you need to build what I'm calling here a population frame. I'm going to talk about the California case. You can do this for the U.S., but for a variety of reasons, this may not be the moment in history to do it for the U.S., but it is the moment in history I would claim to do it in California. So we're gonna try to do this in California. There's a lot of reason to believe that if I come back here in 5 years, I'll tell you that it's done. I hope so. So first, you got to build the population frame. Take the decennial census in California. That is, it's for the U.S., but we can just take the California portion of it. We can match that to vital records. So whenever a birth occurs in California, we have records of the parents, and that's the moment also at which a social security number and identifier is assigned to the child. Various other information is available in vital records. Take the American Community Survey as well. That's delivered every year to a small portion of the population in California, and it provides more information than is available in the decennial census. And then we can use California tax records and Social Security Administration earnings records. So these are employers who report the earnings of people who are working in their firms. And then, of course, most people file taxes, as most people who are earning money. And the claim is that if you combine all of these sources, we'll have pretty much everyone in California. We'll also add in, where available, homeless surveys. Because the very poor, those extreme forms of poverty, those folks might not show up in any of these administrative sources, but if you add in homeless surveys, you're going to get closer to a full population. It's not going to be perfect, but you're going to do a pretty good job by combining these various sources. And I should say that we have each of these sources for, say, every year, but then you can link them across years. So you're converting cross-sectional data into a longitudinal panel. So the reason why you can do this is that if you have the name, address, and birth date of someone, or their social security number, it's very straightforward to link across years. I'll talk more about how you would address issues of confidentiality and security in doing so. Obviously, that's like job 1. But let me hold that aside for now and just tell you it can be done. So we'll have a panel, so the same person can be identified year after year. So every time they show up, say, in the tax records, you'll be able to link that same person over time. And they're going to show up from time time to time, not every year, but from time to time they'll show up in the American Community Survey. They'll only show up in vital records at a point of birth. And then, of course, every 10 years they'll show up here. So you'll have this kind of patchwork panel, right, where people don't show up in every field every year, but you'll have various ways to track folks over time. And it's not just these intragenerational linkages that can be made, but also intergenerational ones. That is, children can be linked to their parents through the vital records, right? Because that's the moment of birth. We'll be identifying what might be called for lack of a better term, it's imprecise, but the biological parents. They may not actually be the biological parents, but they're close to perhaps being biological parents. They'll be the people who show up at the hospital at the moment of birth. For the mother, you probably know it's biological, but for the father, a little less clear. But most times it is. But then also, when you do your taxes, you often claim a dependent child, so that's like the financial parents at that moment. They may be different from the biological parents. There's a different type of parenthood. And then in the decennial census or the American Community Survey, you have people who are co-residing, parents and children. And so that's like the social parents, right? So there's different types of parenthood that will be revealed. But the point here is that we'll have intergenerational linkages, which will be very important for reasons that I'll discuss later. And this will represent, again, the California population as it fluctuates over time. And it will be self-refreshing as we move into the future. That is, for each year, you'll get, say, a new tranche of tax records. And that will be appended to the existing panel. And you'll have then this self-refreshing feature. Now, I should say, we don't have all the agreements in place to do this. This could be done in principle. But in order for this to be done, we would have to get a lot of agreements in place. And a lot of problems that have to be solved, and I'll talk about them. But it could be done. Okay, so that's step one. That's the population frame. The conceit is we'll get everyone in California, and we'll be tracking the population of California over time. So that every year we'll have a representation of California's population, and we'll make linkages over time as possible, and intergenerational linkages as well. So it's a pretty rich panel. But we'll make it richer. We'll add in various types of program data. So if you get food stamps, we call it SNAP. If you get food stamps, the recipients of food stamps will be identified through the administrative records on that program. You get temporary assistance for needy families, which is sort of the core cash assistance and workforce and child care assistance program within the U.S. If you get TANF, you'll be identified. And your participation in that program will be known. If you get unemployment insurance, the same thing. If you get disability, that will be identified. If you participate in the criminal justice system, that will be known. Your educational records can in principle be linked as well through the California Department of Education. Again, these agreements, some of them are in place for some limited types of analyses. Others still have to be negotiated. But the point is that once you have this population frame, you can then add in administrative data that won't pertain to the full population. Not everyone gets food stamps. So actually, a lot of Californians do, but of course, not everyone. Not everyone's on disability. A lot of Californians are. Not everyone's in the criminal justice system in California, but an appallingly large proportion of the poor population is, and so forth. So you have the population frame on the top, where you, by virtue of assembling these types of data sources, you'll have everyone, and then you'll have participation in various types of programs and institutions. That's step two. And then step three is to link to surveys, experiments, and other types of interventions. So there are various types of surveys that are very small, might only be like 10,000 people or 20,000 or 50,000, but nonetheless their value is greatly increased by virtue of linking to this infrastructure. There's all sorts of variables that aren't available in the surveys themselves suddenly become available. You can run a survey in a lean and mean way because you don't have to collect these kinds of data, which are extremely costly to collect and would only be collected with much less accuracy if you had to ask people about it. You can forego doing all that work and just ask whatever you need to ask in the survey, and so they become lean and mean instruments, much cheaper and much better by virtue of linking into this infrastructure. Of course, that would have to be with consent, and we'll talk about that. You couldn't just do this without the respondents giving you consent. You'd explain what the value is, the scientific value is, and they would decide if they want to give you access to this information. You could run experiments within this infrastructure. I'll talk about some of that. Very powerful field experiments become available to you, and you can decide which sorts of interventions work best on the basis of these experiments. You can evaluate other interventions. I'll talk a bit about that too. So you might say, well, this sounds pretty difficult. It is difficult, but is it impossible? Not at all. And I want to talk about what sorts of problems are going to be faced in trying to assemble this infrastructure. I'll focus on problems that I think you might think are pretty difficult to solve, but in fact aren't that difficult. I'll try to make that claim, and then I'll talk about some challenges that are maybe a little more difficult, but still I think surmountable. Okay, so let's start with some problems that I think can be readily addressed. There's the governance problem. So each of these data sets have, as it were, owners. Now, in some sense, you might say, how could that be? These are the people's data. These are data that are collected typically, in fact, I think always, with taxpayer money. They're our data. But nonetheless, there are people who own them. Kind of strange. It should be the people who own them. But their representatives own them. And they make decisions about the conditions under which they'll be released. Or there are existing regulations in place that are putatively the outcome of the governance process, the democratic governance process. Existing regulations in place that control the conditions under which the data will be released. So the goal would be to have all the data owners, their representatives, on a single board in California. And when, say, a researcher says there is a pressing policy question, we want to evaluate whether or not the earned income tax credit supplement in California is actually paying off and doing good things and reducing poverty. We want to make that evaluation. But to do that, we need to link vital records data that will tell us about health with say, tax data. So then all the representatives of the data that you need to make that happen would be on this board. You would write the proposal. You'd say why it's in the public interest to carry out this analysis, and the board would either decide that yes, the data will be released or not. As it stands now, it's very difficult. You have to go as an individual researcher and negotiate the release with each of the relevant agencies. It's this one-off operation. It's very time-consuming, daunting, and reduces the amount of this research by a massive factor. This would make it easy and straightforward and transparent. So that's the governance. I think the governance problem can be solved. There's the linking problem. That is, I talked about how you have to identify individuals who appear in different data sets, and then as they appear in them over time. This is, in fact, not much of a problem. If you know someone's name, birth date, and address, you can link with very high accuracy. The Census Bureau has been working on this for a very long time and is very successful, and the methods are well developed. They can be improved, but they're very well developed, and the kinds of errors that you get are much lower. It's a much lower order problem than, say, survey non-response or attrition, as people falling out of a regular panel study or opting against participating. This is a much bigger problem and increasingly problematic, whereas linkage is a relatively minor technical problem. Okay, here's something that a lot of people might have been waiting for. Should we want this? Should we worry about compromises in security and confidentiality that are more troubling and worrisome than the benefits? That has to be one of the most important questions that any of us would ask ourselves. So, I think, the backdrop to this, the larger backdrop, before we get into some of the more technical issues, The larger backdrop to this is that, of course, in the private sector, it's standard practice to carry out linkages of this sort and to exploit proprietary data. For what purposes? The purpose of making money, right? And we consider that standard. That's what Silicon Valley is about, in large part, is exploiting privately owned data that they've harvested in some fashion for the purpose of making money, right? And we think, well, that's how Silicon Valley runs. And we think it's, I guess, okay, except when there are high-profile breaches. Why is it, then, that when it's publicly collected data through taxpayer money, why is it that we can't use those data for the purposes of deciding how best to spend public funds? That would seem to be pretty straightforward. If you're willing to exploit linked data for the purposes of helping companies make money, if you're okay with that, now maybe you're not. But if you are, you surely should be okay with using taxpayer-collected data for the purposes of trying to figure out how best to spend our taxpayer money. Seems like it's an easy call. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't work crazy hard to make sure that security and confidentiality is protected, right? I mean, that would be job one. But in principle, if you can be convinced that this is a solvable problem, then I would hope you're all in. So let's now turn to those very concerns. And I think you have to distinguish here between what I would call first order and second order concerns. The first order concerns, the ones that we should really worry about, are legitimate threats to confidentiality and security. And there's real reasons why we should be concerned. And then there's the second order concerns that matter from the point of view of someone who's committed to this enterprise, in the sense that it's the fallout from unwarranted public worries. That is a public that sees extraordinarily incompetent and inexcusable malfeasance in terms of the private sector allowing for breaches, and worrying, reasonably enough, that that same sort of malfeasance will be in play when you have public sector data. Now, I'm going to try to convince you that those sorts of worries, that kind of malfeasance, isn't going to be in play in the public sector, but that's something that you can judge whether or not it succeeds. So let's now turn to the first order concerns. That is, legitimate threats to confidentiality and security. So the first point to be made is that the identifiers that would be used in order to effect these linkages are just production tools. That is, the linkages are made behind a firewall. The Census Bureau has been doing this for many years. The linkages are made, usually with social security numbers, but other identifying data as well. They link the data, but then the released data never come with the identifiers, never come with the social security numbers. That happens behind the firewall. Then the data, and they're never released in a public way. They're released into what's called the Federal Statistical Research Data Center. But even after the identifiers are stripped, they're never publicly released. They're released in a very secure environment, but nonetheless, they're still just production tools. And so what I'm proposing here is actually what the Census Bureau has been doing for some time with no problems. So there's no new concerns. The second point is that it's not like anyone is going to get these data. It's going to be government officials and researchers who submit a research proposal about some program evaluation and make the case that it's in the public's interest to get the answer to this question, and have been vetted themselves, background check, and also are capable of high quality scholarship, so that the analyses, the data aren't being released to folks who don't know how to do what they're doing. This has been happening already in a federal statistical research data center in the US, and the protocol for doing so is well worked out, and there have been no problems as yet. A long and successful track record. So there's no new concerns here. No new concerns with respect to using identifiers as production tools. No new concerns here. Now we'll ramp this up. We'll do a lot more of it. And so you'd have to be worried, and we can talk about this, as to whether or not the same high standards can be maintained and preserved once there are more researchers doing this. So that would be, I would think, a legitimate concern. But in principle, we can solve it because we've been doing it already successfully. And then the last point to be made is that when these data are released, so we use identifiers as a production tool in a very secure environment, but then they're released into a Federal Statistical Research Data Center, also a very secure environment. And that's where the actual analyses are carried out. No identifiers, but linked data. So in principle, you could re-identify, right? But no actual explicit identifiers. But then when these data, if say census data are being used here, there's another disclosure review round after you carry out your analyses with de-identified data, and then you have some statistical averages that you want to release. There's going to be a review process, a disclosure review process, where it's determined whether or not there's any possibility of re-identification to occur by virtue of the averages that are released. So like you wouldn't want the average to be based on such a small number of folks that indeed it's possible to identify some particular individual who would be part of that average. So that disclosure review takes place before the data come out. Now, there's some real work to be done to ramp up the quality of this disclosure review and to make sure that re-identification is impossible. That's a zone where further work can be done. But in principle, it's, again, a solvable problem. So I'm trying to convince you that we can do this and that the payoff to doing it is high and the risks are low if we do it right as we can and have. Now, that doesn't address the second order concerns. It doesn't mean that the public worry will be commensurate with the actual risk. But I think here the question is just to have open discussion, just like we're having now, about what we propose to do and see if it stands the test in terms of whether or not people think the risks are worth bearing. It's not like there are zero risks. There are always risks, right? And the question of whether those risks should be taken in light of the possible payoff, which I think is substantial. Okay, so now I'm back. That was a pretty lengthy discussion of security and confidentiality. Now I want to talk about some of the remaining challenges that are perhaps even more daunting. So in order for this to happen, we have to negotiate memorandums of understanding with various government agencies. That's hard work, but that's why God invented lawyers. So I think we can do this. It's just money, right? It's money to buy the lawyers to make this happen. They're doing good. They're doing God's work, right? They're making sure that the conditions under which the data are released will protect confidentiality and security. So it's not. I don't mean to disparage this at all. It's a very important work, but we know how to do it. It's just a technical problem. Here's another technical problem. So in the U.S. case, a lot of the older data have to be digitized. And this is important in order to recover long-run effects of programs and interventions. I'll talk more about that later. But these aren't actual data, I should say. That would be a breach if they were. These are a mock-up of data, census data. And you see here that we have the names. In order to actually carry out the linkages, we need these digitized. And you know how when census data are released publicly, which happens after X number of years, I should have remembered this, like 80 years after the survey, so the 1940 is now available, must be 70. When they're released publicly, they're actually we use low-cost labor in some unnamed country to actually hand digitize this. But I'm talking about data that aren't publicly released because that 70-year period or whatever the right number is hasn't yet passed, and so it can't be publicly released. It would be illegal to do so. So all of this has to happen behind a firewall, and that means it would be U.S. labor, U.S. Census Bureau labor, and that's way too expensive. So it has to be machine digitized, and it's actually, so we've been working in collaboration with the Census Bureau to figure out how to do it. It's not, the existing technology is not as good as you might think. You might think, well, what about check cashing? Or, when you go to, at least in the U.S., when you go to the the store to buy something, you put in your credit card, and then they, you have to sign. I don't know if you have to do that here. Maybe not, but we do. And then there's some little putative check. Whether or not it's really your signature, but I don't know if in the U.S. everyone knows that you can just do anything. Just go, and it does not matter what you do. You always pass. It's just a fake check. Which is because it's really hard to do this. But anyway, we hired a company, and there was the competition behind the firewall again, because these are protected data. A competition behind the Census Bureau firewall to see whether or not deep learning could be used to successfully digitize, and they can. So this can be digitized by machine successfully. So that's a challenge that actually, we got a grant proposal from National Science Foundation, rejected it and said, we can't do this. It's not possible. There's a proposal just to find out if we can do it. They said it's so difficult that it couldn't be done, and we're not even going to give you the money. So we got other money, and we did it. And so this is solvable. So you might say, well, is it too expensive? It's actually not that expensive. It's mainly one-time costs. You have to get you have to negotiate these agreements, so lots of lawyers. That's not cheap. But if you ask yourself what is being created here, it's the capacity to do evidence-based policy, to actually change the way in which we run our country, not on the basis of ideology and politics, but on the basis of the evidence. If you understand that's what's at stake, then negotiating some agreements with a lot of lawyers isn't all that expensive. You got to do the linking. That's not that expensive. You got to harmonize. That is, you got to make sure the variables are defined comparably across the various data sets and over time. That's not trivial. That's just hiring a lot of social scientists. It's a full employment policy for social science. That's great. So these are all just one-time costs. Then once you refresh, you'll have the system ready to go. So the actual sort of increment of new tax data and new census data and so forth won't be that expensive on a year-by-year basis. And then, of course, you have to exploit the new capacity. But I think that's not going to be expensive. There are legions of social scientists who would like nothing more than to contribute to the public good by analyzing which programs are working and which aren't. It's free labor. We're now doing, as social scientists, a lot of crazy, stupid stuff. But if we had access to these data and could commit to the task of figuring out which programs are delivering, and it's really difficult intellectual work, it's rewarding stuff to try to figure out, to use new methods for causal inference to actually identify the causal effects of a program. It's intellectually fun stuff, and it's immensely important, and we'd have a huge workforce of social scientists who would gladly commit to it if only they had the requisite data. And so I think the money problem can be solved, especially because, at least in California, it's consistent with the big data sensibilities of Silicon Valley. They want to do this kind of stuff. They want this kind of solution to poverty. A big data solution is very attractive to their priors, and I think they're ready to step up and pay for it. I hope so, at least. And it's consistent with their growing worries about the externalities of everything they're doing, such as creating poverty. Okay. So let's imagine now that it's happened, that this is built. What do we get out of it? So I've waved my hands when it comes to the argument that there'll be a big payoff. I want to now make the case in a more explicit way that there'll be a big payoff. And it's worth all of this effort. It's worth the non-zero risk of breach of security and confidentiality. I think it's small. I think we can keep it very small, but obviously it's non-zero. So you have to be willing to take that risk. And you only should be willing to do that if the payoff is big. So what is the payoff? Well, first, I'm not going to talk much about this, but I just want to mention it once. Improved monitoring of key social indicators. We don't have the capacity to monitor trends and all sorts of very important labor market outcomes. For example, yesterday I presented some research in which we had to jerry-rig an analysis of trends in social mobility an analysis that I would argue speaks to one of the most important commitments of the U.S., a commitment to deliver equal opportunity. We had to jerry-rig it because we didn't have this kind of infrastructure available to us. We had to make all sorts of assumptions. I didn't talk about them much yesterday because I was embarrassed by the assumptions. But, for example, we had to assume that the copula is unchanging over time because we had no alternative but to assume that. So all sorts of compromises, given our current infrastructure for monitoring trends, have to be made. And we'll be able to monitor trends, where the country stands with respect to its key commitments, much more successfully once we have an infrastructure of this sort. But that's not the main reason to do it. I think it's an important reason, but it's not the main reason. The main reason is capacity to evaluate programs, to evaluate existing programs, and to build new interventions so that we can run our poverty policy and all sorts of other labor market policies on the basis of evidence. So let me talk about exactly how program evaluation will be improved were we to have what I just described. We have 10 reasons, and then we'll be done. So just bear with me. 10 reasons, just by chance, that happen to be the right number of reasons. 10 reasons why we'll be better off in a big way if we were to have this infrastructure, okay? Reason 1, long-run effects of programs can be well assessed. So one thing we've learned from social science, I would argue, is that you cannot ignore the long run. You ignore the long run at your peril. Why? There are two types of problems if you ignore it. First, you have possible washout effects. So a program like, say, Head Start, which is an early childhood training program in the US, a program might have very large effects at first, and if you stopped your analysis after a few years of monitoring the effects of the program, you might conclude that that program is immensely successful, and then you stop monitoring because it's very expensive using conventional panel methods where you have to laboriously follow up with each person and collect data on them and worry about attrition and track those folks who just don't want to do it anymore because it's so painful. So usually we don't do long-run analyses of the effects of our program. It's just too expensive. But that means that if the effects weaken over time, you've got a problem because you've misunderstood the effects of that program, and you could be spending tons of tax dollars in ways that they ought not be spent, given the long-run effects. So often there's a washout. The only way you're going to discover washout is to track over the long haul. The only way you can tractably carry out a commitment to long-run analysis is if you have an infrastructure of the sort I have, because the alternative is to do one-off studies, one after another for each program, at immense cost to the taxpayer. Now there's another problem, is the so-called sleeper effect. Sometimes the initial effects of a program look like they're zero, nothing, and we might say, oh, throw that program out. But then the effects turn up later on. All sorts of sleeper effects like this. And so again, if you don't do the long-run analysis, you could make big mistakes with respect to the payoff to a program. And if we had the infrastructure I described, with linked administrative data, if we recover the past data so that we can examine the long-run effects of past programs like Head Start, and if we refresh with new data, we'll be able to carry out the long-run analyses we need to at very low cost. So that's payoff number 1. Long-run effects seamlessly tracked. Payoff number 2, intergenerational effects seamlessly tracked. So this is just a long-run effect, but it's a particularly important type of long-run effect. It's a long-run effect that happens across the generations. And a lot of the payoff to, say, our anti-poverty programs, and I'm just using anti-poverty programs as one example of the payoff, but a lot of the payoff to anti-poverty programs happens intergenerationally. So you make an investment like you give the adults the earned income tax credit. This is money that's given to folks who are working in low-pay jobs. They get a little bit of extra money in their tax returns. And what's been found is that there's payoff to the adults themselves, but there's arguably an even more profound payoff to these supplements to earnings with respect to children. For example, the children's health, because parents use that extra money to engage in various types of behaviors, like move to a little bit better apartment, a little bit better neighborhood, that then have implications for, say, the amount of stress to which the child is exposed, the amount of crime to which the child is exposed, might make them possible for them to afford high-quality early childhood education, all sorts of things that parents can do with that extra money that have implications not just for the parents, but for the children. So if you ignore the effects of a program on the children, you could make very, very bad decisions about whether or not that program pays off, because intergenerational effects are often so important. And as I've already mentioned, these linked administrative data will include parental identifiers. And what's so amazing, so great, is that lots of different types of parents will be picked up here. Not just biological parents through vital records, but financial parents through tax filings. That is, do you claim that child as a dependent, which means you have some amount of financial responsibility for that child? That could matter. And then also social parents, that is the parents who are actually living with the children. All that is available. So this is an approach that's tailor-made for the new forms of family complexity that we're seeing in a lot of countries. Okay, that's payoff number 2, intergenerational effects. Payoff number 3, you can see how programs are playing out differentially for different populations. We now have, often in the US, and especially with respect to poverty policy, pretty much one-size-fits-all policy. We just assume that all the various types of poverty can be addressed through precisely the same set of programs. Although we have a putatively decentralized poverty policy in the US in the sense that states are responsible for much of our poverty policy, in the end of the day, actually, it's pretty much the same policy that's in programs that are delivered across all the states. It's just the extent to which they commit to them that differs. So we've committed to one-size-fits-all policy, but that may be completely wrong. It may well be that poor children growing up on reservations have different sorts of needs than poor children who are growing up in deindustrializing cities like Detroit, or poor kids are growing up in border communities right next to Mexico, or poor kids who are in urban areas may have very different sorts of needs than poor kids in suburban areas or in racially concentrated areas. There's lots of different types, sadly, lots of different types of poverty in the US, fundamentally different types of poverty in the US. And we just assume that the same policy works for all those different types because it's way too expensive to actually carry out analyses across all the different types of subpopulations in play in the US. But if we had this infrastructure, we would have the number of cases to do just that, relatively straightforwardly. An army of social scientists who would stand ready and willing to undertake those sorts of analyses, and we can figure out if one-size-fits-all policy really works. If it does, great. If it doesn't, we can do something about it. Okay, payoff number 4. This is probably the most important. Better causal inference. I mean, that's what we got to get. We got to get high-quality assessments of the causal effects of programs, not just descriptions. We need the causal effects of these programs. That's what it's all about, right? If we don't have causal effects, what's the point? And one of the most important revolutions in social science is a new capacity to undertake non-experimental causal assessments. Now, in some cases, and I'll talk about this later, we can do experiments within this infrastructure, and that's wonderful, but sometimes experiments won't be possible. And yet we can exploit these new methods for causal inference for the purposes of assessing the effects of programs, and that's the gold standard. So let me just give you one example. It's kind of arbitrarily chosen, but it's important work by my colleague Christopher Young at Stanford. And he wanted to examine the effect of the so-called millionaire tax, which has become increasingly popular in the U.S., especially tax on millionaires. A lot of states have adopted it, but it's been very politicized. And so some politicians have said, if you tax them, they will leave. So it's millionaire tax flight. That's the argument. So, no state wants to tax their millionaires if that's just going to reduce the tax base because the millionaires flee to another state, right? So they need to know. And the purpose of taxing millionaires isn't to be punitive, I don't think. It's to raise revenues, to cover the cost of running that state. But if it's not raising the revenues, well, we need to know. But it's been very difficult to assess this. Why? Because our surveys don't have very many millionaires in them. And so you need to use tax data. and with the sample size that tax data affords, you can carry out bona fide causal analysis. So, for example, it's not just that you need lots of millionaires, you also need to exploit kind of conventional methods of causal inference to get the effects of these of millionaire taxes. So you can exploit state-specific rollouts, right? We know when states rolled out the millionaire tax, and we can do a difference analysis, for example, to then assess the effects of the rollout. Or what Cristobal did was to examine behavior in border counties. That is, there are counties in the U.S. that straddle two states. So some people in that county are exposed to the millionaire tax, other folks aren't. This would be a very easy way for a millionaire to relieve her or himself from the tax. You just step across the border to the other state that doesn't have the tax. So this is a nice test when there's low transaction costs, and which is virtually, when it's be seamlessly easy to move. So how much moving happens? So there's all sorts. This is just scraping this. There's a lot of ways in which you can assess the causal effects of this policy when you have big data of this sort. And Cristobal's done an amazing job. I encourage you to read his work. And that's just one random example of how, when you have lots of cases, it's not just that your n's bigger and you've got significance. It's that you can now use these new methods for causal inference very aggressively and successfully. Okay, number 5. As I said, you can also carry out experiments. I'll give you an example of one experiment in which we're involved in a minor way. It's the basic income experiment. So Y Combinator Research, an accelerator in Silicon Valley, is currently putting up, I think, about $65 million to run a basic income experiment. Our very small job in that experiment is to help them locate it within the administrative infrastructure. So what that means is that when you're one of those lucky folks who's selected to be the recipient of the basic income, as much as $25K, you'll be given over 5 years. Or if you're the less lucky person who's in the control group, you'll be asked if you're willing, so as to assist social science in determining whether or not the basic income is doing what it's supposed to be doing, whether or not you'd be willing to allow us to link to your administrative data, to your employment data, to your program participation data, to your tax records, and so forth. In the pretest, when people are asked that, they all agree. They recognize how important this is. They recognize the threats that the country is facing through possible loss of jobs, through automation and robots and so forth. They're very worried about this, as all of us are. They recognize that this is a historic test in which Y Combinator Research has put up a lot of money to figure out whether or not basic income is going to work. And so they agree. They say, yes, I will do this. And so that means we can unobtrusively monitor the effects of the basic income. Do people quit their jobs? Do they invest in human capital training so that they can then get employed at better jobs? What are they doing? We can unobtrusively monitor for the people who receive and for the control group. Virtually free, right? Virtually free. So that Y Combinator Research can spend all of their money that they've so generously given for the purposes of providing a basic income and not for the purpose of carrying out what would be a horrifically expensive panel study if we had to do it the regular way. Now, I should say, for any experiment, even experiments that have already happened, as long as you can get the list of people and you can go back and get consent, you can link them. So you can evaluate past experiments as well. But certainly prospectively, when you want to carry out a new experiment, you can carry it out in the context of this infrastructure and assess its effects virtually for free. As long as you have consent. Okay. Number 6, we're almost done. A lot of our concerns are about the effects of various types of institutional participation. We need to know how damaging, for example, our commitment to a high incarceration policy is in the U.S. It's, again, immensely expensive to try and carry out these assessments in the regular way, fielding surveys of a one-off variety. But instead, you can do it in the context of this infrastructure. So you can examine, for example, the effects of within-prison training and education programs. committed to a whole host of these kinds of training and education programs for those who are incarcerated. So we need to know if that's working. There are lots of programs in play now for reentry support. So California is engaging in a pretty historic experiment to release a lot of folks who are incarcerated. And there are different programs that are being tried out in different counties as to ways to ease people back in. And we didn't know if they're working. Now, I should just step back and say, we're talking about one of the most horrific, I would guess, but let's see where the evidence stands, one of the most horrific experiments, social experiments we've ever done, of just putting people, poor people basically, in prisons. Lots and lots of them, right? So this is a huge problem in the U.S. And now we've got to try to dig our way out of this hole and try to do it in the least damaging way possible. And this kind of infrastructure will make it possible for us to kind of dig our way out in an evidence-based way. And lots of other institutional effects can also be examined. I just chose incarceration, but there's lots of other effects that we need to know much more about. I went on and on about how we mainly have one-size-fits-all policy, but it's not totally true. In some states, especially California, there's quite a bit of decentralization. There's more devolution of policy down to the county level than in other states. And so we need to, if we're gonna have different programs in different counties, it would be pretty stupid not to mine that variability for what it can deliver with respect to information on which of these various programs is working and which isn't. Yet now we just run, these hundreds of experiments across the many counties of California, but don't then exploit that experimentation for the value it can deliver with respect to learning what works and what doesn't. So once we have this infrastructure, we can do just that. We can also monitor the effects of events, like hurricanes, the Flint disaster, plant closings on poverty. It's kind of obvious, so I won't talk much about that. Make surveys much more cost effective. They're immensely expensive now, and response rates are going down precipitously. It's very hard to run successful surveys anymore, and very costly. But the advantage of having this infrastructure is that you only have to ask the questions that are not already available within the context of the infrastructure. So it dramatically reduces the cost of surveys, and you're not abusing the time of your respondents because you're only asking them exactly what you need and nothing more. Now, of course, this is conditional again on the respondent giving you consent to link to the administrative data. If the respondent doesn't, then this won't work. But if you can't sell to the respondent the importance of the project that you're undertaking and why the public needs to know whether or not these particular programs are working, then probably you shouldn't be doing it, right? So if you fail to get consent, it might be a signal that this is not a study that should be undertaken. Last payoff, program interactions. This is really important in that we had this complicated layer of programs in play to reduce poverty. And then we try to pull out each one from the complicated web within which it's inserted and try to get the net effect of that one program, but often there are going to be interaction effects. That is, the effects of a program depend upon the other programs with which it's combined. And to try to tease out those interactions without having a big data set is pretty impossible, but with a big data set it is possible. So then we can authentically evaluate programs within the context of the environment in which they actually are inserted. That's it. I guess there are a few more slides, sorry. Then I'll be done. So once this infrastructure is available, we won't have to go to Sweden incessantly. I don't know. I love Sweden, but if you're a social scientist, you read so much about Sweden. Why? Because they have these extraordinary data, right? But then what we find ourselves having to do, because we don't have data nearly as good, is that you have to make inferences about what would happen in the US if we had, on the basis, so you have to try to make inferences about whether or not programs should or should not exist in the US on the basis of whether or not it's working in Sweden. That's stupid, right? But we do it because that's all we've got. But that Swedish leap of faith, if I can call it that, that is that what happens in Sweden will happen everywhere. It's not a leap of faith that we should like. We're forced to make it, but it's pretty begrudging, and it's only because we don't have an alternative. But this will allow us, if it were available, to stop making the Swedish leap of faith and stop having to read so much about Sweden as much as we love it. Okay, this is the last line. Truly. Okay, it's just my last little plea for why we should do it. I'm going to try to roll it all together and convince you. So first off, it's sort of the normative side of it. It's the people's data. It's our data. And we let the private sector cash in on their proprietary data. We think that's fine. We ought to think it's also fine to use public data for the purposes of trying to figure out how to build the best possible public sector. I can't think of any higher value than that one, and because I think the problems of the future are going to be problems that are going to be solved principally in the public sector, and so we need to figure out a way to make the public sector as good as it possibly can be, and we have the data to do it, and we just need to find a way to use them. This would mean putting politics right where they should be. Politics should be all about, for example, deciding how much poverty we want, given a known cost for reducing it. Now, I actually think there'll be a known benefit. When we actually figure this out, we'll figure out that every kind of unit reduction in poverty will increase GNP by X. And so actually we'll be saving money by reducing poverty. But whatever, we need to establish through the kind of infrastructure that we develop what the cost of poverty is, and then let people decide how much poverty they want. But they can't decide how much poverty they want without first knowing how much it costs. And so our job is to assess the cost of reducing poverty, if there are costs of reducing poverty, and then let the people decide how much they want. That's the role of politics, right? How much poverty do you want? That's the public judgment. But we can't make a good judgment without having the kind of data we have to know what it would cost to reduce poverty. And then the people can vote. How much do they want? But it shouldn't be the case that we're voting about programs, right? That's a technical question. It's not the question of politics. So if I'm right, that many of the problems that we're facing, profound problems that we're facing, are going to be solved in the public sector, then we need to have a very, very efficient public sector in which we have the visible hand of evidence creating efficiencies in the public sector. This is the analog to the invisible hand of the private sector, right? And so we know that that invisible hand is very, very flawed, that there are all sorts of market failure. Invisible hand's doing, I would say, a pretty horrific job. And just as we're discovering all the problems with the invisible hand, we have now the capacity to create a visible hand that's extraordinary, based on big data. For those who like this kind of argument, I'm going to give it to you. There's a competition between countries as to who's going to build the most efficient public sector. Sweden's done a pretty good job of it, in part because they have the data. If I'm right that a lot of the problems that we're facing are going to be solved in the public sector, then the winning countries will be the ones who can learn what works and what doesn't, who have the data available to them to make informed decisions about what sorts of investments and what sort of public sector to build. So it's a big competition between countries. It was once run, I would argue, through the invisible hand, which can create the best and most efficient invisible hand. Now it's going to be a competition about who's going to create the best and most efficient visible hand. And so a country that doesn't join into this competition is going to be deeply compromised because it won't be able to build the public sector that works that other countries will. And then my final argument, we have an opportunity in front of us to actually realize this particular vision of an efficient public sector that's informed by the evidence, not by politics, but we have to act before cynicism fully sets in. There's a fairly high level of cynicism already. We may not have much more of an opportunity before we just think it is impossible, and that there's nothing out there but a world of politics. But I think we do have a moment, and we ought to exploit it. Thank you very much.